Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Meeting the New Demands of IT Security and Compliance. My name is Joel Anderson. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Tier 4 Advisors. Genuinely looking forward to today's session, which is in conjunction with our sister company, Tier 4 Group. And we are excited to have Niki Rabren, who is the Executive Director, Cybersecurity and Professional Services with Tier 4 Group, hosting this panel. And we're also grateful to have our panel with us today. Marc Punzirudu, who is the VP of Security Consulting Services with ControlScan. bharath.vasudevan, who's the VP of Product and Technical Marketing with AlertLogic. DaMon Ross, Senior Vice President of Tier 4 Secure, a subset of Tier 4 Group. And Dan Hollinger, a Global Partners Program Manager with Cloudflare and Rackspace between that partnership. So thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar will be recorded, so it will be available for replay on our website and also will be emailed out to all of our participants. And then lastly, if you have any questions for our panel, please use the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. You'll be able to type in a message to ask all these smart folks here on this webinar. So we'd love to be able to hear from you if you have questions. So with that said, Niki, I will turn the time over to you and the rest of our panel.
All right. Thank you, Joel. I'm looking forward to moderating the conversation today. You know, one of the interesting things about working in the solution provider or vendor community is that you have an opportunity to work with a lot of different clients in a lot of different industries and geographies. Sometimes you're solving the same problem, sometimes you're not, but you have an opportunity nonetheless to compare those experiences to one another, to the decision-making, the strategies that go on. And so I think that's certainly an interesting nuance that having the solution provider panel today will be able to shed on this topic of, you know, what are the new demands of IT security and compliance. But before we get into the conversation, what I really wanted to do was allow each of our panelists to tell us a little bit about their background so that we can understand the lens that they're approaching IT security and compliance through. So Marc Punzirudu, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Niki. So currently Vice President of Global Operations for Security Consulting at ControlScan. Spent about the last 10 years as a GRC consultant. And prior to that, I had to build my own GRC department and manage information security and overall IT projects for a multinational restaurant chain.
Great. bharath.vasudevan, I love saying your name. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Oh, you bet. So I've been currently doing product and technical marketing, running that team for AlertLogic. But in the past, my background is definitely IT focused. So 20 years, starting from R&D, working all the way through kind of the bringing products to market and through sales. Last 5 years, been focused on cybersecurity, really more around SOC tools, SOC functions, and data protection.
Great, thank you. And Bharath comes to us today from beautiful Austin, Texas. And so I appreciate you bringing a little bit of that into our webinar today as well. DaMon Ross. Yes, exactly. DaMon, you are perhaps the old man in the room, and you and I are close in age, so I say that I'm right there with you. But give us a little bit about your history and your background.
Sure. Prior to joining Tier 4 Secure, I've spent the last 20 years in cyber operations, primarily in the financial sector. I currently reside in the Atlanta area, but prior to Atlanta, I was in the Northern Virginia, DC area, working in some of the some pretty large financial institutions, running security operations, cyber threat intelligence, incident response. It's kind of been my wheelhouse for the last couple of years.
And then some. All right,
yeah.
And Dan Hollinger, tell us about your background.
Yeah, I've been working at Cloudflare now for just over 5 years, helping connect clients and partners to a better internet. Before that, I was spending time at Google, Verizon Wireless, working as a software developer and management consultant.
Okay, great. So variety of experiences for our conversation today for sure. One of the things that we talked about, guys, is the nuances associated with looking at security from an infrastructure perspective versus a classic cybersecurity perspective. So DaMon, why don't I throw this question to you? When it comes to IT infrastructure versus cybersecurity, where do you define and draw the line between what the infrastructure teams typically bring to the table in their roles in securing the organization versus what the cybersecurity team is focusing on?
Sure. So typically your infrastructure and IT teams are going to be responsible for the health and maintenance of the hardware, underlying operating systems across the IT environment, where your security teams or your cyber teams are going to be focused on the data that those tools are generating in search of a potential actual cyber threat or cyber attack.
And so, Bharath, would you agree? Is that kind of how you've seen the delineation, or does the technology change any of that focus?
Well, you know what? We have customers of all shapes and sizes, and sometimes that is one team. Sometimes it's other teams. A lot of times it's the lens of uptime, service time, keeping it up and running versus looking at it through the lens of vulnerabilities and safety. So it's the same ultimate problem. I mean, we can talk about things like patching. Well, whose job is it and why are we doing it? Is it because I'm trying to stop vulnerabilities, or is it I'm trying to maintain uptime? These guys have to work together, like service windows. So it really depends on the size of organization, the layout, and how these guys are set up to work together. But, it's uptime versus security. It's just the lens you're looking at the same problem.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. And I do see that myself. And, certainly I think, DaMon, your background being in banking and financial services, the lines of demarcation, if you will, probably are a lot more prominent than maybe even in a smaller banking IT infrastructure. So, and one of the other things that kind of comes along with that is the nomenclature, I think, in terms of talking about the technologies used to secure something. Dan, I'm curious because we had a conversation about buzzwords, talking about enhanced network security versus zero trust, right? Infrastructure teams might be more akin to thinking about enhanced network security as opposed to the zero trust conversation. What are some differences that you're seeing in terms of, an infrastructure versus cybersecurity focus on the same topic? And when it comes to enhanced network security, what are some of the things that people are focusing on now?
Yeah, great question. And I think buzzwords is the correct term, because really we're trying to define a new paradigm that doesn't quite work with the walled garden approach of the past. So some of the clients we've worked with are really making that transition to networks that they don't control. They can't build a perimeter around. They're using more SaaS-based solutions, public clouds. They're looking at a remote workforce. So really the old paradigm doesn't work, and we're trying to find the buzzword that does. So this is where a zero trust model comes in, where every request and every user is being revalidated each time on every device. And really finding a way to make sure that those authentications can happen at scale and seamlessly.
Marc, what about your thoughts on that same topic?
Yeah, so I think that they are wonderful concepts, and I think that they're really important to organizations who are looking to take things to the next level. But I do also believe that there is a lot of putting the cart before the horse at times with some of these. The concept of restricting everything to a least privilege model has been around for a very long time. And zero trust is an adaptation of that. It is changing, moving that paradigm forward to, as Dan mentioned, the per request model, as opposed to just authenticating and having access to the minimum amount possible. A lot of organizations are still doing being polite, a mediocre job at some of those things. And I think just understanding what you have and who needs to have access to it, and some of the basics are really critically much more important than digging into, say, zero trust or enhanced network security right away. So those should be things that you're visiting after you've already hit, a level 3 or 4 of maturity of your security program, and not get wrapped around the axle on them in the beginning.
No, that's a good point. It's that whole crawl, walk, run, right? I mean, there is a Maslow's hierarchy for every single discipline, and certainly trying to master some of those foundational things are important. I'm curious, as we've talked in the past about the difference between, network operations centers and security operations centers, again, two different organizations that have a different business value that they bring. But a lot of the practices and the technologies today are starting to converge a little bit, those two organizations. So Marc, if I could just stay with you, in what ways are you seeing those organizations, maybe converge, or are the lines starting to, or continuing to be drawn a little bit? Certainly there's a technology play that kind of comes into that factor. What are you seeing among your clients?
Oh, I see a combination of things. Sometimes a NOC and a SOC, for example, may be shared personnel. Some it may be separate. It depends on how large the organization is, what they can sustain in terms of budgeting and whatnot. I mean, but it is important to mention that, similar to the conversation that we had for the first question with Bharath and DaMon, that a NOC or a network operations center is a function of infrastructure. Their purpose is to predict and find performance impacting incidents, to meet SLAs, to manage availability, making sure that the assets are accessible and available. That's really their focus. Whereas a SOC, the Security Operations Center, they're also looking at alerts and metrics and KPIs to look at things like performance, but they're looking at it from a security perspective. They're not looking at it in terms of performance or availability. So it's much more related to incidents which impact the security of data and assets versus the availability of data and assets, like you would in a NOC.
So Bharath, from your view, certainly the SIEM technology is enabling some convergence, at least in terms of you can have a same tool or a same solution that might be able to serve multiple audiences, right? As you start to use a SIEM platform to get into DevSecOps, right? And to look at your application uptime. How are you seeing those teams, either work more closely together because they're able to leverage some common solutions, or are you seeing, them continue to stay separate?
It's funny. If I look at what a SIEM can do today versus what a SIEM could do 4 or 5 years ago, I think it's a night and day, disparity between, how powerful they are now. I think the challenge that comes with it is that it's now become a platform more so than just a tool. So there's a bunch of customizations, a bunch of training. You have to become proficient at the SIEM, and even, different kinds of technologies, whether it's the role of analytics, whether it's the role of orchestration getting rolled into the SIEM. They're very powerful tools that can do a lot of things, but now they're behaving a lot more like platforms, which require specialized skills, specialized training. So you might have the fanciest car in the world, but if it's impossible to drive, it just looks beautiful in the driveway. I'd rather have something that can get me around and get me from place to place. And if that means I need to use a self-driving car or have someone else do it for me, maybe that's the right answer.
Yeah, Dan, I see you nodding your head. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, we've definitely seen that movement towards kind of offloading it to a third party, just given the need of expertise around the events, the security, and just making sure that they're being handled in a way as opposed to building it in-house.
And DaMon, from an industry perspective, what are your thoughts on, as SIEM technology continues to advance and improve, and I know you kind of came from some larger environments, so maybe this is a shared question between Bharath and DaMon, but, logging solutions, there are still some open source options that are out there, right? And the ability to kind of ingest and analyze that data. Are there clients that are trying to have like a poor person solution, if you will? I hate that phrase, but being able to kind of cut corners so that they can achieve the same end. And it is all about outcomes. So what outcomes do you see being driven between the size of clients that are not necessarily able to adopt some of the more robust solutions?
Yeah, I do see a combination. And it really depends on, in my opinion, the skill set of your staff. When you go with, I'm a big open source fan myself. However, it's definitely a full-time job maintaining it because you don't obviously have the vendor support and support contracts. So based on budget and of course size, there are some shops that I've worked in some that they use 100% open source, and because of the skill sets and the experience of the staff that they have, it works great. Some others, they want to rely on a more commercial product that they can have, you know, external support. And as Bryce said, a lot of places have realized that, you know what, it's really worth, it's actually worth the budget to just outsource it because of the resource drain that it can place on a security team if you don't have the resources to support a SIEM. It's definitely a full-time job.
You know, Niki, if I go back to more of my IT days, about 10 years ago, I think we were all having a similar discussion around, you know, open source, open stack versus someone's distribution of it. And, you know, there's like, why wouldn't I mean, it's like DIY and a special tier of DIY when you're doing your own support. Then there's DIY and someone else does the support. And then there's, hey, let's just let someone else do it. So, you know, I think open source brings in the, you know, you're the hyper do-it-yourselfer guy. But, you know, when you run into problems, there's no one to call. You're, you know, going to forums, you're going to see if there's best effort anywhere out there, if anyone else had your same problem. And, you know, I don't know of a lot of organizations that have that much patience to get to their outcome.
Yeah. And so I'd love to kind of pick up on that, Bharath, in terms of talking about that outcome, right? And in the maturity level, going back to Marc's conversation around, you know, maturity and trying to figure out what you need to be good at first, what are those outcomes and how do they differ according to an organization's maturity?
It's super interesting because as we start down pursuits, we have these discussions. We'll learn very quickly if someone's trying to meet the box, get the check mark for compliance, for retention, or are they trying to extract security value out of it? So there's IT outcomes, there's compliance outcomes, and there's security outcomes. And really a lot of that, to DaMon's point, is really around the maturity of that organization. And we see it almost falling across in two big distributions. There's people that just want what they need to get through the audit. And then there's people that have embraced that, hey, look, security is something that I really need to care about. I don't want to be on the news. You know, Chase Cunningham at Forrester, he has one of the best graphics. And if you guys have seen this, you know where I'm going with it. But it's a guy on a bicycle or a motorcycle, stark naked with a helmet and boots on. He's compliant, but he's not secure. And I mean, that's it, right?
Yeah.
What do you want? Do you want to say you're compliant or do you want to be secure?
Yeah. No, I love it. That's so funny. I used to work with Chase, and so he's got a million of them. So Marc, you know, this is a great segue into the whole compliance conversation in terms of, you know, whether it's the naked guy on a motorcycle or, you know, every single retailer that's ever been breached, technically they were PCI compliant. So they weren't the secure as, you know, they maybe should have been. So where are you seeing clients kind of, you know, walk that line and maybe even use a failed audit as an investment flag to say, we've got to spend more money, you know, being compliant and letting compliance kind of drive the conversation versus having the balance to say, look, this isn't going to necessarily help us be even more PCI compliant, but it is good security and we need to do it. What is that conversation looking like with the folks you work with?
So I like to start off by first framing what is compliance, right? Mm-hmm. Compliance is a minimum baseline for security in an environment. It's not a goal. It's just a pit stop on your way to wherever you're going. If you're not trying to go above and beyond the minimum baseline for what you're required to do contractually, that's an organizational culture problem. That is not a security problem. That is a tone from the top. And that you have to have executive buy-in. You have to have a good tone from the top, or the rest of it is kind of a moot point. I would also tell those, you know, retailers who say we got breached and we were compliant that no, you weren't. You were not compliant. You may have been compliant at a point in time 6 months ago, but if you do follow those controls, you know, PCI catches a lot of guff because people say, well, I paid for this audit a year ago and I got them to sign off. And so on and so forth, when their goal is a compliant report. So they do everything they can. They push every button they can to just obtain that report for their bank so that they're good until next year. And that is not what the intent is, right? The intent of compliance is to create of all kinds, not just PCI, is to create a business as usual environment So if you're performing those things on a day in and day out basis, you know, I had a conversation with a very large retailer a couple months ago that was going down the PCI is bad rabbit hole. And I just said, which control in PCI would you not consider in an enterprise security framework? You know, it's slanted specifically at confidentiality. So it is around a specific data set and a specific scope. But what practice from least privilege to multi-factor remote authentication, to vulnerability scanning, to penetration testing, to having a SIEM, you know, and all these controls, which ones would you say are not good enough? And they were unable to answer. And I said, it's painful because someone's making you do it. It's a culture issue. When I hear folks say that they are looking for, you know, I love when someone says, please put the gloves on. That's my favorite thing, because that means they want the truth. You know, they're not in it to get their checkbox and move on. And those are my favorite folks to work with all the time. And yeah, you go in, you put the gloves on, you do a very thorough job review and everything. You give them a punch list, and then they can take that to their executive management and say, a third party has put this on paper. Now what do we do? But I think the majority of those cases, you know, those are folks who often have trouble explaining to the C-level and getting the budget authority. You know, security is a cost center, right? So you have to get budgeting and getting the budget they need to do the job they know they need to do. And that third party coming in and telling them, once it's on paper, it can't be ignored. So that's something we see quite a bit. And I got to tell you, from my perspective, like I said, that's my favorite thing to have happen, because it means that they genuinely are trying to do the right thing and not just, what is the bare minimum I have to do to get your signature on this paper?
Yeah, and you talk about getting executive buy-in, and so much. I mean, compliance is here because it's making a business point to say you have to do these things in order to reduce the risk of someone doing business with you, whether it's a patient in a hospital system or it's somebody who's swiping their credit card in your store. But it is hard sometimes for business people to understand how to correlate that risk with the investment. So I guess, you know, riff on that for a minute. And if I could maybe plant a question that says, how are we doing as a solution community, as an IT community, in terms of having the conversation to help our business partners understand what that risk means and why we need to protect ourselves in a different way?
Well, I think as a market, we have failed the security community, but we're getting better every day. So it's come a long way from 5-7 years ago, but I think, right, time to market is king. Whether you have a solution and you're enlisting a vendor to help you, or you're a vendor who has a solution, whatever it is, time to market is important. And I think that technology has enabled so many decisions to be made without forethought of security, because you can move at a dime. You know, DevSecOps, I like to joke around that, you know, the S in DevOps is security. It's getting better, right? But with that, I mean, you can stand up an Azure environment, an AWS environment, and in 30 minutes have a production app running on the internet, taking payments and healthcare data. There is no check or stop to make you consider these other things like security and compliance and everything else that comes with that along the way, unless you know. So I think that, you know, it's a double-edged sword. Technology is an innovator and it's a driver to help business grow quickly. But it's also something that I think every organization needs to stop and look at what they're actually doing right before they do it, and factor in adequate security budgeting at that point. Once you've already deployed an application in Amazon or anywhere in the cloud, doesn't matter where it is, and then you find out that there's requirements to have this enterprise security program in place that has these other steps that might cost you an extra $100,000 a year, that's faulty budgeting on the project. That's not a technology problem. I mean, there's no compliance gods sitting back saying how we're going to make a standard and it's going to be painful. The standards only exist because people aren't doing those things on their own. I mean, to be just blatantly honest about it, PCI compliance wouldn't exist if payment card breaches didn't happen all the time. HIPAA wouldn't exist if people automatically protected patient data all the time, and there was never an issue. Those things are always, compliance is always a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to something that's going on. And the way to prevent it sucks. You know, if it wasn't for Enron and MCI WorldCom or the next company, we wouldn't have Sarbanes-Oxley either. So it's that's the way it always goes.
Yeah, yeah. Bharath, what about your view on that? Because you were nodding your head a bit there too.
There's so much there. I mean, it doesn't.
Separate conversation.
Well, it's raise your hand if you were in the security team and you were consulted before your organization made the move to O365.
Yeah, right.
Nobody.
Yeah.
Nobody. And then it's like, and then if you did, it's like, oh no, I was just kidding.
Yeah.
or were you called in when there was an incident and now you start to put some focus on it?
Yeah.
You know, to Marc's point about all the things being spun up and run in AWS and even Azure, right? You can do a point in time look, but there's drift that happens beyond that.
Right.
So, you know, we've used things like CIS benchmarks to at least give them a point in time and then a month later rerun it and say, hey, look, have you gotten any better? You know, we've had to do this. Hey, your on-prem is pretty good, but your AWS is a mess. And people don't completely understand the shared security responsibility model either.
Yeah.
It's, I put my hands up, that's their problem. Well, it's not really. So a lot of education that has to go through the process. But to Marc's point, right, you put something on paper, you show them where their CIS benchmark score is, how they are relative to their peers, how they've been over time. Now it changes their ability to go get that. And the other huge trend we've seen is that most boards of directors are now having somebody who is cybersecurity savvy on the board, asking the right questions in that room. And that's starting to trickle down as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, Marc, I think you mentioned the term security culture, right? And that was something else that we kind of chatted about together earlier this week is how are we doing? And Dan, I'll throw this to you. When it comes to building a security culture, you know, there is no right way, but what are some things that you've seen be really effective in terms of get everybody to kind of understand that, you know, it's not just the job of the cyber team or the infrastructure team or the NOC, right? There is some conversation, even if it's the employee that sits at the front desk, to not push that stupid, you know, button on the link that exposes everybody. What are some practices that you're kind of seeing out there?
Yeah, I think one thing that Cloudflare does really well specifically is we try to take a blame-free approach. So to help build that culture of security, you know, once you're putting responsibility on each of your employees, not just the security team, not just the technical teams, then you really need to make sure it's safe for them to bring forward issues, be it they clicked on that phishing link, they lost that device. You know, Cloudflare specifically has a story in our history where our CEO got hacked, his email got hacked, and we had to deal with that. And so from that point forward, we try to make it as friendly and easy as possible to bring a security issue up, bring up anything suspicious. So that way we as a company can then take the proper steps to get it addressed and get it fixed. You know, ideally not just for that individual or not just the fallout from that incident, but moving forward. So I think taking a blame-free approach helps build that transparency that then makes sure people know that they're safe to be transparent and take care of security as best as they can.
Yeah. And DaMon, you have kind of an interesting experience point, I think, that's unique in that you've worked a lot with external cyber threat intelligence companies to be able to understand what the threats are, and even taking that into your C-suite to help the executive community understand this is kind of what we're facing, and this is how it permeates even our business operations. So can you share a little bit more about that experience and how you've used that to maybe help, you know, with executive buy-in and kind of drive security culture at that level?
Sure. So cyber threat intelligence is relatively new, I would say, on the private sector side. I think government's been doing it for some time, but it's really about helping your decision makers, your C-suite, understand what threats are out there that's applicable to our environment and why, and then being able to provide examples of things that are going on in the threat landscape, compare it back to your environment, and to be able to communicate how susceptible we are to that same threat and what we need to do to ensure we get ahead of it. I think definitely organizations that have cyber threat intelligence capabilities definitely have an advantage, but it's still a growing field, and not a lot of organizations have a very mature capability. But it's all about being able to communicate what's going on across the threat landscape, which typically could be a lot of very technical, techie jargon, and being able to communicate that over to that non-technical audience, which I'll admit has always been a struggle for me and a lot of us that came from that hardcore techie background. But the conversation is definitely being had more now. The C-suite is more interested. They're asking those questions. They want to understand what is going on out across the threat landscape. So they're asking the right questions. I think we just got to continue to refine how we can communicate it over to them in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the world is changing, right? I mean, it's changing because people are, even the business, the C-suite, the boardroom, they are more cyber aware and they are asking those questions. I'm curious, maybe I'll ask this of Marc initially, is we kind of find ourselves in this new reality, right? Things are changing every day. We were talking just before this call, do you think we'll ever see ourselves going back into the office, right? Or are we kind of comfy now that we're working at home? How do you see the security agenda changing in your client's organization? And it doesn't necessarily have to be as a result of this pandemic we're facing, because the security agenda has been changing. But as we kind of put the pandemic view on that, do you think is it business as usual in terms of what we're doing from a cyber perspective? Have things changed really that much since we all kind of, went into this kind of remote world? And do you think that the agenda for trying to advance our maturity as a cyber organization and inside a company, is that being slowed down at all because now, the economy is changing and people are being very cautious of investment? Or do you think it's increasing just because of the enhanced risk of a remote workforce?
So I'm going to give you the most consultant answer humanly possible. And I think it depends.
Right.
Right. So I try to not ever say that, but here we are. There are definitely some organizations that, of course, these more recent events, think of organizations which rely on activities that are slowing down right now. Driving. So if you have an organization that relies on driving, buying gasoline, obviously it'd be impacted. Companies that run tolls, parking garages. There are these weird industries that you don't think of. Restaurants that don't have drive-through or curbside or, have undergone any digital transformation are obviously impacted. So there are a lot of things that have been impacted, and I would say in a way which has caused their C-suite to pause all of their agenda because they're really just trying to stop the bleeding. And then there's a lot of organizations that what this has done has been the single biggest driving factor in accomplishing their digital transformation goals they've had for the last 5 years. And it has accelerated a massive amount of stuff happening and things getting done as they've been planning on doing for a long time. So you look at organizations that a lot of restaurant chains, this is probably one of the bigger ones that I've seen. A lot of them went from not having any form of to-go, anytime, any sort of not using DoorDash or any of those third-party vendors, didn't have any e-commerce whatsoever, magically and suddenly overnight accelerated their blueprint because it was that or have problems keeping the business afloat. So I think there are some areas, we were joking last week when we were talking about this, that, what has been the single largest that poll on LinkedIn where it said, what has been the single largest driving factor behind your digital transformation growth? Fiber optic internet, cellular capabilities, fast, low-cost computing, or COVID-19. And I mean, the reality is it's the latter. So, I mean, that's for most cases. But, I would also say that over the last 3-4 years, I mean, before all the recent events, security was starting to, and it still is, it's getting its time at the table. The CISO is actually a C-level executive with board visibility, not just a placeholder. As mentioned before, there are folks on boards which are asking the right questions about cybersecurity. I see it very heavily in the private equity space, which never happened before. Like anybody who's ever dealt with that space knows that private equity and venture capital, unless they had specific niches they knew about, cybersecurity was not a major part of the discussion. And today, it really has become a very visible part of the discussion, from pre-close through acquisition, through merger, so on and so forth. So it really is getting its time in the sun. But it's a difficult road ahead. Security, there is no ROI on security. It all adds to your total cost of ownership, which makes that number, let's keep it as low as possible with achieving our maximum goal. So I think that there's always going to be a struggle, and it's not supposed to be a business disabler, security, but
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult to turn it into something that is enabling business. That's
interesting. And Bharath, you have leaned in like twice on that question. What is your view?
He's right. I mean, there's so much variability depending on organizations. And I've seen this current situation pull products or pull projects from the bottom of the list to the top of the list. Mm-hmm. I have a friend here in town that he does tech work for this produce supply that does B2B, that services all the restaurants. Well, you know what? Overnight, they started B2C.
Yeah.
With volumes that you don't, so they'd been working on it. That project had been shelved. It never got to see the light of day. But when all the restaurants stopped buying, how agile can I be to dust this off and get it going? I mean, those are the kinds of companies that are going to survive, but they didn't have the capability to do this overnight. It's the culture where they had built that all along. They just didn't have that forcing function to push it above the line. And now that's happening.
Yeah.
On the exact flip side, right? I see guys in the same situation. Like, my days are inundated provisioning soft phones now, because everybody who was working in the office is now from home, and now they can't do their job. I mean, again, that was about a month ago, but I mean, that's a time where they weren't focused on their day job. They were provisioning soft phones.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
No, that's a good point. And Dan, I'll kind of leave that topic, with you as CIOs and CISOs. We are in a work from home world right now, and who knows, it may be a little elastic here over the next pick the time horizon, whether you think it'll be a year or just a matter of months. But the chances are, even when we go back, we may find ourselves coming right back into our homes. So as companies make this transition, what are the 2 to 3 most important considerations that you think that the C-suite needs to be making in terms of being able to plan for the short term while also thinking about the long term?
Yeah, and I think, at least from our perspective, we've seen that we've been in the category of companies that are accelerating their move to cloud native and cloud native solutions in order to address that workforce need. I think the 2 or 3 most important considerations are really around visibility and control, and possibility flexibility, so adaptability, because at the end of the day, the attack surfaces are going to continue to adjust and grow. And if you can leverage tools and service providers that can help you gain that visibility and control, it makes it easier to transition over time, transition quickly, because ultimately being able to see who's accessing what, defining that access across those users and devices and applications, and be able to onboard and adjust, be it a workforce that needs spun up, be it soft phones that immediately need spun up for that workforce, or threats that are now approaching that new attack surface. Because interestingly enough, the data we're seeing is attackers aren't taking a break during COVID. I don't know whether they have access to more tools or just more time on their hands because they don't have to commute. And, attacks are actually going up during this time period, and especially for the new vulnerabilities on these new kind of landscapes for these customers.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Joel has let me know that we have a question from some of our listeners, and I think this would be a good time to kind of put this in here. The question really extends around what we were talking about earlier in terms of relying on third parties to do some of the work for us. And so the specific question is, how are clients balancing what they ask third parties to manage versus what they try and take on themselves? Are you seeing kind of surely there's not a formulaic, but does that change at all amid kind of the time that we're in right now? Bharath, I'll throw that question to you first.
No, I mean, I think every single one of us in some way, shape, or form has had to revisit our budgets. And it just has to happen. And a lot of times people are cutting deep because they don't know when they're going to come back. And a lot of times, the security budget isn't the one that's safe in that one. So if you are having to make some hard trade-offs, sometimes a managed approach might be a way where you can shift fixed expenses to OpEx, find a way to stretch your dollars and make it happen. So, I'm now working harder than I have in a very long time because it just keeps coming now. But I mean, that's what we do, right? It's managed security, and the demand has gone up or it's gone away. It's one of those two things. Like, companies worried about solvency aren't worried about protecting for the next year or two. Companies that know that are going to be around, they're doubling down. So, that's the break we're seeing. But if you're having to tighten your budgets, looking for other approaches to still hit that outcome, because that's what everyone's going to be measured on. Golf, there's a joke. It's not, how you got there, it's how many you got there in. And that's all that gets written down. Did you make it? Yeah. So that's what we're fighting right now.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. Joel, do we have time for one more question, or are we at the end?
We do. Yeah, we have time for one more question.
Okay, this question came in for Dan. Dan, now that we're in this new telenetwork or telework environment, are we exposed to threats? Are we more exposed to threats and being hacked than previously related to small business and the larger corporations? And if so, what are those?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in short, the answer is yes. You have, more applications from a SaaS-based model where you're allowing people to log in from anywhere, from any device. So that introduces risk at the device level. I'm using my home desktop, which I'm sure my security team has not vetted. So there's risks, that I'm taking on personally that are affecting the company. I think this is where, as customers are exploring their options, they're exploring SaaS-based solutions because the economies of scale can make that, attractive for their, now restrained budgets. And for service providers that are recognizing economies of scale as well in leveraging security-based expertise more effectively than building it in-house, I think that's where small, medium-sized businesses are leveraging those SaaS-based solutions and trying to do it in-house, or in the case of, one of the reasons we've partnered with Rackspace is they're leveraging the expertise of Rackspace to manage those solutions for them. So kind of in summary, the landscape is going up. The risks are increasing as you're letting customers, or your clients as well as customers, use remote work and remote work-based solutions. So finding ways to help address that via SaaS and via managed service providers is a good model that we've seen for most of our customer base.
Very good.
Niki, one thing I'd add is if my kids were at school, I would be a lot less distracted and I would have a lot more vigilance. So I think all of us as users are just more distracted as well.
No, that's a good point.
So I'm not always focused on it. I'm like, try not to, okay, I'm going to click that, but your guard's down a little bit more when your family's around and everything's not the way it should be.
Yeah, no, well said, as my son messaged me through Alexa as we were starting this webinar. So very good, you guys. Thank you so much. DaMon, Marc, Dan, Bharath, I really appreciate all of your input, and I will turn it back over to Joel.
Yes, thanks, Niki. And again, thank you to our panelists. Great conversation. If any one of our attendees has any needs related to IT security, compliance, NOC and SOC, anything that we discussed today, feel free to reach out to our panelists or to a Tier 4 advisors or Tier 4 group member, team member directly. Their information will be available that will be sent out along with the follow-up after this presentation. So again, thank you for joining us. Join us next week, next Wednesday, as we talk about the top IT priorities for the entire C-suite. What the CEO, CFO, COO, CIO, CTO are all caring about right now and collaborating on. So we'll be diving into a conversation that will stretch across the entire C-suite next Wednesday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So thank you all again. We'll talk to you soon.